wanted, there we go. Okay, first of all, yeah, I got it. There are a couple of people who I know for sure could not be in class today. All right, in a second, we're going to choose the presentations for next Thursday, right? Before we do, there are two things at least that I wanted to mention. I've taken out one of the readings. There was another reading along with the Radio, the Airwaves article. I have found it useful. I talked to a couple of students, and I remember that I had some notes on that. They found it really challenging because it's about sort of the historiography of the networks. There's a lot of valuable information in there, and it's good for background, but I just think there's not enough there for us to present on. So I took that out. So there are only 6 readings, okay, this time around. I mean, if anybody wants to read it just to read it, I can email it to you or something like that. But I took it off there because I didn't want there to be a distraction and have somebody think, oh, I'm going to have to present on that. You're not. That's the first thing. The second thing is quite a few of you have not yet entered any notes for Module 1. And that is required, even if you present it. Remember, these are just summary notes to indicate to me that you've taken a look at and kind of understand the theme of every one of these articles. Remember that part of the purpose of the presentations is to make that easier for you. You know, we do the presentations, we discuss the materials in class, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it, at least, you know, you're a little bit prepped on what we've emphasized so that when you go to the material, you can get through it a little more elegantly. You don't have to spend quite so much time fighting with it. I don't mean to make it easier. I just want you to be able to get more out of the material. And my experience has been that when people present, in other words, when you hear from your colleagues, you know, a discussion of the materials, it seems to unlock something with people where they think, okay, well, if they can understand it, I can understand it too. And then I try to sort of fill in the blanks and connect the dots and things like that. Does that make sense? I'm concerned that some of you, because it is a little bit of an unusual assignment, some of you might not have understood that, yes, even if you present, you still have to do that. It's all part of that module's grade. When I grade, whatever, like your presentation or whatever, I'm including the quality of your notes as well, okay? And some of you are actually going to do better, I suspect, than you might have done because your notes are very thorough. And it shows me you put the work in, okay? And I think that's valuable. And also that the quality of your notes demonstrates that you really do understand the material, okay? Are there any questions on either one of those? Yes, Renee.
So for the thing that I presented on, I took quite extensive physical notes. Is there, forgive me if I'm just being dumb about this, but is there like a way to upload a picture to that journal, or would you rather me like type them out from
did you write them like longhand on paper?
Yeah, I did, because
old school.
You know, honestly, I forgot about the first one, and then I started writing down the notes that I had written to the digital way.
I blame the parents, okay? Your mom and dad should have told you not to do that anymore. Penmanship is not something we grade anymore. Now, that's totally cool. Well, obviously, I'd be willing to look past the notes for what you presented on. If you just put in that area, I'm not including what I presented on.
Okay.
And name that article. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you know, if you presented, I don't necessarily need your notes on that presentation. I heard what you have to say. So that's okay. I would say don't worry about that. And you're just talking about that for that specific reading, yes?
Yes, just for that.
Don't even worry about it. Just remind me in the notes, you know, you had said, you know, for us not to include the notes for what we presented on.
Okay.
I thought the presentations went very well. I thought that they were, in the main, pretty comprehensive. You did, on balance, I think, a pretty good job of going in and kind of extracting what was most relevant to the course in those readings. So if we can use those as a kind of guide or a template in how to do this, I think we're going to do fine. Okay. All right. So are there any other questions before we assign presenters for the readings? Anything else? Any other upkeep? Anything about the upcoming assignment for those of you who are going to do that, which is most of you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're presenting next week, are our notes just going to be on that one we're presenting, or are they going to be on every single one still?
Okay, that's exactly what I just answered, but that's okay.
Sorry, I
You don't present notes on what you presented. You present notes on everything else. But remember, even
Okay.
brief notes, this is not an essay.
okay.
I mean, some of these articles can be easily encapsulated in 3 or 4 really cogent sentences. It's not like you need, and you can also do them in outline form if it's clear from that outline that you're not just listing things, but you understand what they mean. Okay, this is note taking. Okay, and the reason why I want people to do that is before you do your finished assignment, go back and look through those notes again, because at the time you take those notes, that's your first reading of something. Okay, and those notes will remind you these are things either that we discussed in class that were considered to be important, or in my first reading these were important. And when you pick the 2 readings you're going to write on, right, go and read them again, but first look at those notes. Okay, it's really more for you, so that you have a source, sort of a source of your own perceptions to begin to build your summary on, your analytical summary. Okay, but yeah, several of you have not done that. You do need to, it is required. Okay, you will lose points significantly if you don't do that. Okay, all right, then let's go ahead. If there are no other, are there other questions?
I have one. Quinn?
Yeah.
So I was planning to write on the propaganda for children, like for the 2-page writing assignment, the newspaper article. So I don't have to, just reaffirming the fact, like, so I know this is like every 2 weeks we have a class, like the class is divvied up into 2 weeks.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's
So-
there's a little variation there.
Okay, so just in those 2 weeks, you either do a presentation. This is just clarification. You do presentation, or you do a nice, very good 2-page to 4-page essay.
And the essay has to include at least two of the readings.
At least, okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
the
that
reason
is
for that, Quinn, is so that it's actually to make the assignment a little easier. In other words, one of the common ways that we address this kind of thing is we put 2 together and see if they create a contrast or if they reinforce one another.
Okay.
And it's useful to learn, how do these things connect? Because the purpose of the course is to give you a much broader and more comprehensive understanding of these connections between media and politics. And
Okay.
one way to do that is to not force fit things together, but just sort of understand organically. Again, using things like those notes. Oh, now that I've written those notes, now I see how these things fit together. I see, if nothing else, I see why Hughes put these in the same module.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for that. That actually gives a lot more clarification. With that, since I am gonna do I'm choosing to do a 2-page essay on that, I don't need to do like a presentation for next week. It's the presentation or the paper, right?
Yeah, one or the other.
Okay. That's what I just wanted to get set in stone, so I don't get caught and be like, oh, I had to do a presentation.
You only have to do 2 presentations.
Yeah.
Okay. And the idea there is, there's a little less writing work involved in the module where you're presenting. There's still a lot of preparation, but
Yes.
you don't have to write a complete essay. And it just gives you, that module that gives you a little break from the writing end of it, where, yeah, I got my notes and I kind of prepared to do my presentation, but I don't have to try and get another essay past this guy. That
Okay.
kind of thing. It's just it's a little bit of a rest, or a little different way of thinking about the material.
All right. So yeah,
There is a method to this nonsense.
yes. Yeah, I'll get started on that. That's I'm very glad I asked that question, because then
Okay.
I would just be doing a whole essay on one reading.
Yeah,
you
that
for
wouldn't
that.
get it.
Yeah.
And again, when you look at the prompt, it will tell you, discuss any 2 or more of the assigned readings.
Okay.
One of the things I want to remind you, okay, when you do these written summaries, cite your sources. This is still scholarly work, okay?
Yeah.
Don't plagiarize. Don't present their work as your own. Every time that you make an assertion, a fact-based assertion, okay,
It should be followed up with the last name of the reading.
should be the last name, and where it has it, the last name, It can be the last name, the date, a colon, and the page number if it has them,
Okay.
and many of them do.
All right.
Okay, but really, that's important. Don't, in other words, these are not essays of opinion. What you're trying to do is summarize and analyze them.
Analyze. Yeah.
What do they mean? What are the key points here? And if I'm connecting these two together, yeah, you've got to do your own thinking. If you're drawing two
Yeah.
sources together or more, how do they connect? But every time you make a factual statement that is derived from the readings, cite which reading it is and where you got it. Be
Okay.
careful about making sweeping assertions and generalizations for which you provide no evidence. If you
Got it.
find yourself writing something and you think, well, I don't really have any support for that, but everybody knows it. No, they don't. Okay, just figure. No, they don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so
All
much
right.
for that. I just wanted to do that. That is all.
All right. Then what we'll do now, a couple of people have already signed up for things, and I'll mention them as we get there. The first one is the one on radio, and it's very brief. And the purpose of this, as I'll explain, is that it's another one of those examples where we think of the internet as being new media and everything prior to that as being old media. When radio first was normalized after it really exploded after the First World War, a lot of the same kinds of concerns were expressed and a lot of the same kinds of optimism emerged and excitement emerged around radio that decades later would emerge around the internet. Again, revisiting this theme that new media is just new to a generation, okay? Everything was new at some point, and its newness affected the way we talked about power, the way we talked about politics, maybe the way we did politics, particularly the rise of television in terms of campaigning, the presidential use of television and things like that. These are important things, okay? So this airwaves one, again, it's brief, but I want you to give it a close reading because the author is trying to do something that's worth thinking about. So who wants to do that one?
I'll do that one.
Okay.
I'll do it too.
Okay. All right. So there's two people on that. The one on This Is Your Propaganda, it's very similar to an article that we looked at in module 1, but it's sort of, I thought it would be good to follow through on that theme a little bit. Now, let's see, I just want to make sure that Georgia's not here. Georgia England has already signed up to do that. She could not be in class today. But if somebody else wants to do that, again, two people can certainly present on that. Had anybody else looked at that and thought, yeah, I want
I'll take that one.
Okay. Okay, now, the article on reporters and willing propagandists is about the challenges of covering America at war during World War I. And when you see, by the way, you'll see the acronym AEF. And if you don't know what that is, it's American Expeditionary Forces. It's the coverage of the American military operations or the actions of the American military as part of the Allied operations in World War I. So when you see AEF, that's what that means. One of the things I want you to be careful about with this article is don't read this as the author saying, yes, these were propagandists. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. There are some interesting nuances and subtleties because one of the biggest challenges for journalism is covering war. Okay, I thought once upon a time when I was about your age that that's what I wanted to do. We used to call them war pigs because there were some journalists who had a really healthy, unhealthy rather, obsession about covering war. And they had a way of doing it that was compelling and powerful. But when they came back home, they were in many ways just as damaged by the experience as other people in combat. But it's always been a challenge for journalism in sort of the modern, let's say from the 20th century on. How do we cover our own country at war? To what degree are we concerned about being honest and accurate? And to what degree are we trying to support the war effort? Okay. Now, is anybody interested in doing that? I hope somebody.
I'll do it.
Who's I will do that.
Andrea.
Why do I not see you?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Where are you? Oh, you're not even lighting up. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do it too.
Who's that? Okay, Dallas.
Dallas.
Okay. Okay. The next one is, it's similar to this, but it's dealing with World War II. And again, the sort of the peculiar way of covering the war using radio, the immediacy of that, the challenges of objectivity, of not giving away information, of being authentic, and the whole idea of whether or not journalists are actually exploiting war in some weird way. Edward R. Murrow, you should read a little bit about who Edward R. Murrow was. He was pretty important during and after the Second World War. He was one of the more important journalists who called out Joseph McCarthy. He did a pretty revealing television show in 1954 in which he just simply took McCarthy's own words on videotape and sort of functionally used them against him to sort of demonize and ridicule him. It was very interesting stuff. World War II, journalism. Anybody?
I can do that
I'll
one.
do.
Okay, who did we get there? We got two people really quickly.
Oh, one of them was me.
Okay.
And the other one's Lillian.
Okay. Almost done. And then we've got the one on Superman, the Second World War, and transmedia storytelling. Transmedia storytelling, if you're wondering, it's the use of multiple media outlets to tell a continuous narrative. And it's a cultural phenomenon in a certain way that has it creates a certain kind of iconography, a certain kind of myth, a certain kind of image. The classic of that time from the 30s through the 50s being Superman. Okay, the costume was red and blue. He was white. There was all this not very thinly veiled, flag waving patriotism, particularly in the television version in the 1950s, where Superman stood for truth, justice, and the American way. So there's, it was actually using a kid's entertainment program as a kind of attempt at propaganda. Now, Dylan Livero, again, could not be here today. She's already signed up to do that. Was there anyone else who wanted to do that? If you don't, you don't. As long as we have at least one person presenting, we're okay.
I'll do it.
Who's that?
Kevin.
Where are you?
I don't know why it's not lighting up. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Kevin, is that you?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last one, again, another one of your colleagues who could not be here. Do I see her here? I do not think so. Yeah, Sarah Hanna's going to do this. This is a little bit unusual. It's about exporting Yiddish socialism. And this is funny because this article shows how Jews living in the United States, and particularly in New York City, used various kinds of publications to kind of transmit socialist ideas into Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia. Okay, and we usually think of it the other way around. That when we think of the Red Scare, we think of socialism and communism came out of the Soviet Union and they're coming to get us. But from 1900 through the First World War, there were quite a few socialists in the United States. Those who were Jewish and often writing in and speaking Yiddish, which is it's a kind of Germanic language that you would recognize as soon as you heard it. Anyway, they were actually propagating socialism and projecting that into the Soviet Union. And initially, many of them were sort of supportive of a socialist revolution. Not necessarily the one that ultimately came about, but it's a way where, print media were used to actually help stimulate revolutionary thinking in another country in a way that we don't normally think about. Again, we already have one person doing that. If it's not something that you are into or you understand, that's fine. You're going to have to take a look at it anyway, but it is an interesting narrative.
I'd like to do it, Danita.
Okay. All right. All right, well, I think we've got 2 for everything. Smashing. Look at that. We're very thorough here. Yes. SOU should be proud of us. Damn it. but they're not. They ignore us. They think we're not important. All right, well, we got any other questions about that? We'll be presenting next week. I don't think we're going to have a tremendous amount of trouble getting through those in one class session if everybody's here on time and we keep those as most of us did last time. If we can keep those fairly lean and stay on point, you know, we got through those pretty well. It's a longer class than normal, but you know, we can certainly get those done by, you know, 3 o'clock or so. I think last time we went to about 3 o'clock and then we were done. Might have been 3:10 or something like that. The class is supposed to go till 3:20. We almost never will unless we're doing lots of presentations. Remember though, that if we have to, we'll just carry over the remaining presentations to the next week, okay? So let me, if I could, just give you a little bit of historical context for this module and kind of what was going on in the United States. This is essentially the first half century of the 20th century. We're roughly going from 1900 through about 1950. And the key events at the time, arguably being the First and Second World Wars. But, you know, we talked about the USS Maine and, you know, America in the Spanish-American War. So what we're talking about here is the beginnings of the consolidation of American empire. The idea that America is finally sort of pulling together all of its industrial capacity, all of its, you know, its military capacity is very, very embryonic, really up until the Second World War. We don't have a large standing army. We have a relatively small executive branch. I mean, the American political landscape and political institutions of 1930 would be unrecognizable to you. The first thing that would stun you is how small the government was, how little the federal government actually did, okay? This is important because one of the things I wanted you to kind of think about here is how much of what you normally think of as propaganda wasn't carried out directly by the government, but in fact was carried out through various media by people in private life, you know, either people in business or publishing or just people. There's always this challenge when a power is emerging into that sort of global great power status, which is, what do we do with our people, right? In other words, part of being a great power, and when I say, I don't mean morally great, I mean vast, you know, having extraordinary capacity to project political, cultural, economic, and military force, either within a hemisphere or ultimately around the world. Right? I mean it in that sense. China is an emerging great power. Britain was a great power. It is no longer. The United States is currently a great power. Okay, we're not just a regional power or a local power. We're a global power. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. And so if you look at these, you'll find that there really isn't, some of these might make you wonder, gee, is this a political science class? Where's the government in all this? Well, this is important. Most of what happens that's meaningful in politics isn't necessarily going on in the formal institutions of government. What we're doing right now is political, okay, in any number of ways, okay? There's always the risk, for example, that when someone like me is put in an institutional position of authority, that it yields the possibility of the use or arguably the abuse of that authority in order to mobilize people with a specific ideology or partisan plan or something like that. This is always of concern. Most of it is concern that comes from the conservative, right wing, from Republicans. But a lot of that concern, by the way, is legitimate. There are people in American universities who abuse their authority. There are. There always have been. But it's why, for example, not so much in the 20s and 30s, but by the 1950s, certainly, it was absolutely problematic for you to be identified even as a sympathizer of communism or socialism if you wanted to keep a teaching job, okay? If you were in K through 12, forget it. You're fired. Okay. You're lucky you're not being arrested. But even in universities, it's been always kind of problematic. How much, how far can you go in terms of questioning the prevailing myths of the United States, of, questioning, whether or not what you're hearing and what you're seeing is true or is a complete narrative. It might be true, but only so far as it goes, okay? Well, these things were really put to the test when America, and became significant when America began to expand its global reach. And this starts, arguably at least, with the Spanish-American War, okay? That goes all the way back, because even though we're still technically colonies, all right, we're involved in arguably the first modern world war, okay? Most people don't even realize that. But if you look at what was going on in Europe, it was a world war. The reason why it wasn't then significant was A, we were still colonies, okay? B, we had no government to speak of. But if you look at I think I said the Spanish-American War, a mistake. I meant the so-called French and Indian War. By the time we get to the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, all of a sudden it's starting to matter, okay? Because we now aren't colonies. We do have an established government. We've had a long time now to show people, yep, we're the real deal. We've been here for a century. We're going to start flexing our muscles, okay? And what you find with a lot of these articles, not all of them, but a lot of them, is these are exercises in nation building. They really are. Now, normally when we think of nation building, we think of an intruder or occupying government coming in and telling a captive people, you will now live this way. You will build your nation this way. What a lot of people don't understand is this is a history internally that every nation state has gone through with its own people. The challenge of building a nation out of disparate cohorts of people, okay? And certainly at this time, roughly 1900 to 1920, let's say, we're still largely an agrarian people, small town people. Cities are growing, we're urbanizing quickly, but we're nothing like what you see now with vast cities and people concentrated and relatively few people now living in farms and ranches and things like that, supporting themselves through an agrarian life. That is rare, okay? That's probably less than 3% of American families, well less than that probably by now. But at that time, this was a powerful cohort. Where you had people living away from cities, they tended to be either very ignorant about government, but often also very suspicious of government, okay? And they didn't want to be told who they were, and they didn't want to be told how to live. And they also didn't want to be told that they had now to go back overseas and kill people and run the risk of dying. So the challenge is whether the threat is socialism or it's, pre-fascism in the Axis powers of World War I, or, or the sort of the actual, Axis coming together with the addition of Japan and the expansion into Asia of World War II. How do we convince a largely sort of culturally isolationist America that's largely indifferent to the rest of the world, except as a novelty? How do we convince them? Put your lives on the line, strap it on, go over there and kill people for us. Go to war, okay? If you can't do that, you can't maintain great power status. Great power requires extensive military development and extensive military commitment, okay? That means you've got to convince your own people to do that. What I'm trying to suggest here is that most of the time these days, when people think about, like a lot of your conspiracy theorists and things like that these days, they think this is all the government. It's never been all the government, all right? Initially because the government wasn't strong enough, but also because the American government really doesn't have to. The private sector does it all the time. We're being socialized into a national identity every time we watch sports on the weekend. Every time, you go someplace and in order to watch a sporting event, you first have to rise for the national anthem. That's nation building. And it's sustaining that notion of national identity, okay? First of all, does that make sense, what I'm talking about? That nation building is not just an exercise of a repressive government. It's a comprehensive, almost totalitarian exercise of the public and private sectors combined. All the institutions of power enter into a willing collaboration to develop and maintain a sense of shared unified identity, where otherwise it really doesn't exist. I mean, there's just not much that I have in common with most of the rest of America. There really isn't, other than language. There just really isn't. Not such that I have this powerful, passionate sense of being American, you know, like it's a virtue or a particular, you know, advantage or something. It's where I live. Okay. But see, I'm not fully assimilated then into the notion of national identity. You know, it's a constant challenge, because one of the things you find, it's kind of like being secular in a religious culture. You haven't, you know, like you're an outsider. And when you're an outsider, you can be a risk. You can be a problem, because when the nation goes to war, for example, you might be that pesky asshole on the sidelines who starts asking why we're going to war instead of saying, let's go get them. Okay? That's the challenge of nation building for a great power. How do you allow for that to some extent so that you can claim you're a free society and that you value liberty, but not allow it to derail the mission of maintaining national identity, particularly when a military intervention or domestic crisis is at stake? Does this make sense? Okay, in some ways, I think it's timely and relevant to where we are right now, but you know, a lot of this is new to you and you're living through it for the first time. And I don't think it's being explained to you very well. What I'm trying to suggest to you is this isn't new, okay? And it's constant. This is always in the process of happening, okay? Classic example, okay? Think about the media. Now, I mentioned to you before that I spend the only time when the news is not on before about 7 o'clock at night is when I'm talking to you. Okay. Other than that, the news is on, because I got to have that steady, you know, input so I can make sense of it. But here's what I noticed this morning. Okay. Now remember, you're hearing MSNBC and CNN in particular throwing this word insurrection around with respect to January 6th. Okay. Now, technically, they're not wrong. Technically, if you look at the definition of an insurrection, that's exactly what that was. That was an insurrection. It's just that we don't use that language in the United States. Now, part of the reason why we don't like to use that language is because we do value, really do value as citizens, free expression. We might not like what our neighbor says, but really most of us are willing to tolerate it, particularly if it falls short of violence. The reason why insurrection is relevant is because it was a direct, sustained, and destructive attack on a fundamental process of the national government. This wasn't just somebody throwing a rock at the Capitol. This was people going into the Capitol and, as far as we can tell, by main force, trying to stop the certification of the election. That is, by definition, an insurrection. Okay. An insurrection is not the same as war. It's not an occupation. It's not a revolution. Okay. But the problem is, if that's the case, then what do we call the violence that we saw, you know, in the midst of that right now in places like Portland and Seattle, where you had people attacking ICE buildings, attacking federal buildings violently, identifying themselves now as the left. Burning an American flag is not a crime, but it's a political act. Do you see where I'm going with this? In other words, it struck me that CNN and MSNBC did not cover that at all. I knew who would, though. Where did I go to find immediate coverage of that?
Fox News.
Fox News. And you know what? They were right. I mean, Laura Ingraham is an idiot. She was harping on about, you know, they just don't justify this violence and stuff. No, it's not that. But it was a selective omission by MSNBC and CNN. ABC, NBC, CBS did mention it and did show some footage, okay? But I had to go to Reuters and a couple of other places to find footage of that, and then went to Fox. Do you see where I'm going with this? In other words, these are private organizations. This is not the government, okay? But it's political. So the very way that news is framed has political implications. It is wrong to say that this is simply a direct attempt by media to influence outcomes one way or another. Okay, in other words, it's not a media insurrection. They're not trying to overthrow government. They're not trying to stop government, but it's clearly partisan in nature, clearly, in a way that we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, certainly wouldn't have seen 40 years ago. Okay, this is important because, you know, at the time we're talking about now in this module, you didn't see journalists doing that. Not the way, and you know, not the way a Fox News would do with, you know, Portland and Seattle, you know, going back 18 months. Not the way MSNBC and CNN did with every third word being insurrection. And you know what's interesting? The only people using the word insurrection are those people, the commentators on MSNBC and CNN, and Democrats. No one else is using the word insurrection. Okay. Why is that important? Why am I even talking about that? What's the relevance of it?
Well, I'm just kind of curious what, if they're not using the word insurrection, what are they, how are they describing it?
Violence. Yeah. See, using the term insurrection is deliberate because it has legal implications. Okay, the primary reason, other than that technically it can be defined as an insurrection, it's such that it might have to be adjudicated. It's tied in to the potential for prosecution of these people. But you know what they're forgetting? These are the same people who were outraged when the Trump administration would refer to various kinds of violence associated with, the police and things like that, resistance to the police, the Black Lives Matter and things like that, that when the Trump administration or Republicans would refer to that as sedition or insurrection, or we're going to invoke the insurrection laws and things, MSNBC and CNN were just beside themselves. I'm not saying that either side is right or wrong. That's debatable, okay? I mean, I could make a pretty compelling case that none of the violence that occurred in those demonstrations was insurrection. The main reason being they did not target the institutions and processes of government. It's still a riot and it's still violence, but there's no indication that they were trying to stop government from functioning. And that's what an insurrection is, okay? Again, the reason why I'm first of all, I'm trying to link what's happening now to what was happening, a century ago. This isn't new. Secondly, this is all stuff coming from private individuals, from people. Remember, the Republicans and Democrats, that's not government. Those are private institutions, okay? There are almost no regulations or restrictions on being a Democrat or Republican. You don't even join the party. In some European party, you actually join the party and you pay dues and you have a card and stuff. We don't do that. We've never done that. In fact, when people used to want to demonize communists, they would typically refer to them as card-carrying communists. The idea that they were doubly warped, that they were European-style fanatics, and that they were communists, okay? But here, what I want you to look at is the challenge here is, particularly in the World War I and World War II journalism articles, is these people who work for private newspapers or private radio networks are trying to maintain a balance between being loyal to the country as citizens under law, whatever their devotion to the country may be, whether or not they support the war, okay, but also trying to be accurate and fair and have the integrity of journalistic objectivity. You can see where, and if you are a loyalist, you're not objective. If you're trying to support something, you're not objective. And yet if you're a journalist, you're torn because you don't stop being an American if you're covering an American war. You know, if you're a journalist, you're a journalist, but you're still whatever else you are. All right. So that's the challenge you see in those stories. So that's the first thing. Are there any questions on that? That again, the importance of private individuals and private institutions in either driving, resisting, or reinforcing political values. This is important. This is one of the primary functions of media in the United States. You know, you don't make a lot of money in this country by getting out ahead of public opinion and trying to use your media outlet in ways that propagate widely unpopular ideas. This is why Fox News has always had a really limited constituency, because most of America isn't that conservative. Okay, most political independents and Democrats, I mean, they far outnumber Republicans, but it's not just Republicans, Democrats, and independents. When you look at Americans ideologically, when they consider how they consider themselves, the positions that they support on issues and things like that, Fox News is far to the right of most of America. Okay, but where it's not far to the right of is the private organization known as the Republican Party. Okay, up until recently, it was right in the pocket. There was no distance at all between Fox and the American Republican Party. Okay. But this is important because this isn't government. People in government use this. Okay. But this was not it was not an act of government, properly understood, that has driven wedges between people. We can disagree on policy, but that's not the same thing as polarization. Polarization is overrated, but I want that to kind of stay with you a little bit. That don't accept that reflexively, that narrative that you're getting from private news organizations who want to keep eyeballs on screens, that this is a war or a struggle for the hearts and minds of America, because it's not. Okay. Not in the sense they mean. This isn't being driven from the ground up. This, as much as anything, is being driven from the top down. Most of Americans, most of the time, are not very political. Most of America, most of the time, doesn't care about politics, doesn't like it, doesn't respect it as processes, doesn't like politicians, and doesn't want to get involved. That can't, by definition, cannot be a polarized country. So something else is going on. I'm not saying that we don't have, deep disagreements, but we are not, unless driven by private institutions, not the government, but private institutions, unless driven by those, we are not on the verge of civil war. I don't see any evidence that we are. It is a thesis to explore, okay? Now, I could back up and probably just as accurately, perhaps, make the case that we've seen this before. The last time we saw this was the Civil War. But I would go back then and say, you know what? Still, the driving institutions were as often as not private as they were public. This wasn't just an architecture created by, a conspiracy-driven government. This is people struggling for power. But remember, the majority of us out here don't want power. We just want things to work right. Do you see the difference? Okay. So that's one of the themes that begins to develop with this module. Okay. Another one, though, that's kind of interesting is the emerging use of different kinds of media and how we use those media. So the one on, transmedia storytelling and the one on airwaves and radio are interesting because they kind of bookend from a period of relative innocence and naivete about radio and what fun it was. And the tone of that is deliberately folksy. It's kind of like, oh yeah, and people used to do this. They just get on the radio and they would, they'd play their music or, get Fatal out, play a little bit, and then when they were done, they just, okay, I'm done. Like you would do, right? If you were doing like, early YouTube or something like that. It was, in fact, when YouTube first emerged, the first thing I thought of was, this was what it was like to have a radio transceiver in 1924, before the Federal Radio Commission. You could just do anything you wanted. You could post anything you wanted. And everyone was an author, and I remember we put out a parody of a magazine. and it was a parody of a film magazine. And we put out these pretentious, obviously pretentious reviews of really horrible films, as though they were really important. My job was to do all the body of work of Ed Wood, who you might recognize as a kind of cult figure. He did Plan 9 from Outer Space and a bunch of garbage like that. It was a lark that but the fact was, with no money invested, we sustained this thing for about a year. We had a little readership and everything else. Well, radio could do the same kind of thing. The internet does the same thing. How many of you actually have a YouTube channel? Do any of you? Okay, see, you understand what that means. It's like when I'm really asking you, how many of you own a TV station? Is what I'm really asking you. Because you have potentially that kind of throw weight. Well, when people first started with broadcast radio, what you were essentially asking is, how many of you have a transceiver? Was, at least locally, how many of you have a radio station? It was Wild West. It was wide open. That necessitated, in part, the creation of the FRC. But a lot of people think that the Federal Radio Commission, and then its later involvement into the FCC, were these repressive conspiracies of the government. They weren't. They were driven by the National Broadcasting Company and RCA, who wanted to monopolize the airwaves, because particularly by 1933 with the FCC, they had finally accepted, we're going to put advertising on here. Imagine that for about the first decade of broadcast radio, advertising was forbidden. It was expected that you would not advertise. Okay. Since that time, we have had no medium of significance in the United States that has not been supported by advertising. Even on YouTube, if you want to monetize, you're kind of compelled to advertise something. It's really hard to avoid that. So anyway, that's the other thing. So we have the notion of the challenge of nation building and covering war, and the challenge between loyalty and journalistic integrity and objectivity on one hand. But we also have this transition that we see within the space of about 25 years from this kind of fun, novel, naive experiment with homegrown radio until we have Edward R. Murrow sitting in London in the midst of the Blitz and broadcasting on NBC, okay? And those things change. When you see the Superman article, the weird thing about that is you think, oh, it's just a comic book. Comic books can be used, and were used, as propaganda. They absolutely were. Same thing with the This Is Your Propaganda. Okay, it's creating for children a certain narrative of the virtue of war. It's the perfect narrative for an emerging empire, because you want children to be raised, especially young boys, to be raised in a martial spirit, to have the virtues of a martial upbringing and martial discipline. Okay, but what you'll also notice when you look at that, there isn't a lot of emphasis on individualism, which is something we're supposed to be all about, the individual. You don't find that there. It's more about loyalty, hierarchical authority. It's very authoritarian, okay? There were still vestiges of that when I was a kid. I remember getting in trouble in class because I had learned the word fascist, and I referred to the Boy Scouts as a fascist organization and got sent home, and it figures I'd end up doing this, right? But it struck me as, there were uniforms and, little signs and salutes and badges. It was very military. And I thought, I think I asked, how is that not fascist? Mr. Hughes, I think you're on your way home. Stop by the vice principal, which usually meant you were beaten, by the way. For some reason, I wasn't beaten, but I was certainly sent home. All right, so these are the kind of things I want you to think about. This period of time is a period of activity and unrest in the United States that is at least the equal of what we're going through right now, okay? But it's different only in the sense that we're looking at the beginning of the emergence of America as a global great power. And what we're looking at, we're seeing that reflected through these private media, okay? That's sort of the theme for the module. Now, does anybody have any questions about that or comments or anything else? Everyone looks kind of dazed. It's like, are you going to keep talking or can I go home now? I'm hungry. Now I'm hungry. I just thought of that. Now I want to eat. All right, so I'm not telling you how to do your presentations. What I'm asking you to do is, as you're preparing for your presentation, think about those themes. Okay, if you're doing the ones on war, think about, oh yeah, this was a period of time when America was first emerging as this great power. They'd come out of the Spanish-American War, they'd flex their muscles a little bit, but the American people wanted to go back home. They didn't want to fight in war. But American corporations were projecting force down into Central America. The lead arm of that was not the United States Marine Corps, all right? It was United Fruit, a company, okay? When Smedley Darlington Butler wrote about this, he said that he was essentially, like a gangster working for American corporations in Central America, not the commander of the United States Marines. Now that was his opinion, but most of this is driven by commercial imperatives. We were not facing existential threats at this time of any significance, right? Now, had we not intervened in the First World War, we probably would have ended up fighting the Germans anyway. Some people, in fact, argue that the First and Second World Wars are really, must be understood taken as a whole. There's a case for that. But that's the period of time in which we're writing. We're seeing, after 1917, the emergence of the Soviet Union. We're seeing the influence of left-wing views on the ongoing process of organizing labor in the United States. And remember, the struggles of organized labor in the United States had a higher body count by far than any of the labor struggles in Europe, anywhere, okay? Most of America does not understand that it was a war, that it was a shooting war. It was a war in which people were murdered and people died, okay? That's going on during this period of time. It absolutely is. And labor is finally finding its power and realizing, hey man, if you're gonna go to war, you kind of need us. You better give us some stuff. Paradoxically, then, you could argue, well, war gave them a funny kind of leverage, didn't it? Maybe it did. Maybe it did. All right. So I want you to think about the political environment rather than just isolating the piece you're presenting on and just sort of summarizing that. How does it fit into what was going on in the country at that time? Now, are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, Jared.
My question is just, is it going to play out how it did last time? The essays for the people not presenting are not due this coming Thursday. They're going to do after we watch the presentations?
Right, because the next essay isn't really due until this Sunday. I always like to leave a lag so that we have a time, one more class period to talk about things, ask questions, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'll open up that prompt well in advance of when they're due. So I can tell you at this point, tentatively, let's see, the next due date is the 9th of February. So you got quite a bit of time. Okay. I don't want you to obsess on deadlines, because deadlines are important, but what's more important is that your work has quality and that you're getting something out of the material. All right. Now, what we'll do is, hopefully, at least I'm hoping, we'll take, in terms of the presentations next week, we'll take them in the order they appear. There is a certain kind of logic to that. But if someone's not quite ready and needs a few minutes or something, or maybe someone's late to class and you were counting on presenting with someone else and we have to delay one, then we will. So, but I would say that all 6 of those presentations, you should be ready to go next Thursday. You should be ready to, even if you had to go first, you should be ready to go. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there any other questions on the assignments or the syllabus or any of that kind of stuff? I apologize for the vagary, Monica and others, with that. I got to figure out a better way to say that, I guess.
So then, are you still accepting the notes for the first readings?
Yes. I won't
Okay.
shut off the notes until after the deadline for the Sunday assignment, because I want you to be able to use them for that assignment. But on Monday, I'll shut those off.
Okay.
So I guess if you really wanted to be funny about it, and create actually more work for yourself, you could enter those notes as late as Sunday. But I would do the notes first and then write if I were you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want clarification about the writing the essay. So we're identifying themes in the 2 different articles we choose, and then comparing and contrasting. That's like the main purpose of the essay.
Well, you're either, There are a couple of ways you can do that. You can either show how one article kind of reinforces another one or adds something to that analysis, gives us more to learn. Think of it always in terms of when somebody reads my essay, what will I teach them? What will they learn? Okay. And it could be, on the one hand, this article suggests that this was the way things were. This one, though, has a contrasting view. Not all of these are meant to contrast one with another. That's kind of your analytical judgment. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions about the written assignment? Okay. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do, there are a couple of things I do normally. All right. But one of the things I will do is if you do a paper and it's just really, it ain't getting it. All right. Let's meet. Don't panic, but let's meet via Zoom, like office hour, right? And talk about how you could rewrite that and improve it rather than having you have all kinds of despair and just think, oh no, my grade point average is going to tank. Okay. I mean, I don't have a problem if someone wants to put the work in and they made the deadline and they didn't realize they'd left something important out and they want another go at it. I generally think, yeah, if it means you're going to give me better work, why wouldn't I do that? Especially since, I hope not everybody wants a rewrite because that creates a lot of work. And also it will distract you from doing the ongoing work, but you'll know what I mean. I mean, if you get like a 60% on something, you're going to probably, unless you're just thinking, look, I don't care. I just want to pass this class. It's not my major or whatever. That's your judgment. You're all adults, you do it the way you want to do it. But if you want to do better, meet with me. And the likelihood is going to be, I'm going to say, look, rewrite it and think about this. And I'm going to leave it up to you if you don't want to do it. And I'll give you a deadline, right? I'm just saying, I don't want people to just immediately panic because the first assignment's a stinker. Now, if you don't turn in the assignment, you're going to have to contact me to see if I'm going to allow you to submit it or if I'm going to deduct points. But if you turned it in good faith and it just wasn't very good, or wasn't as good as you could do, I'm going to probably be persuaded to give you the chance to rewrite it because I want your best work. And sometimes that's going to come, when you've had a chance to reread what you've done. I would suggest, though, don't give me a first draft. Write a draft, let it sit for a day, go back, look at it again, look at your notes, make sure you haven't forgotten anything. Make sure you don't have, run-on sentences and all kinds of chaotic writing and everything. There's really no excuse for that. There can be reasons for it, but they're not excuses. Okay? And usually the explanation is, well, it was just the first thing I wrote, and then I wrote it. I worked really hard on it. I wrote for like 20 minutes. 20 minutes ain't working hard. Okay. I once got in a fight, just to tell you. I once got in a fight that lasted 20 minutes. That's a long time for a fight. It was a room full of people. It's the only time I can think of that ever happened. That's working. But you writing for 20 minutes ain't working. So don't tell me it is. Okay? Come on. Okay? Anything else? All right. So you got until 11 o'clock Sunday. I'm sorry, Brett, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you had a couple minutes after class. Because
I do. Yes, sure.
Not relevant to anybody else.
Okay. No, that's fine. Otherwise, yeah, I guess have a good weekend. Be sure you give yourself plenty of time to finish that assignment. If you panic, if you hit the wall, shoot me an email rather than not turn the assignment in. Okay, Brett, we'll wait till everybody disembarks and then we can contact.
Thank you.
Okay. We still got a couple people here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not of any particular.
It's up to you, man. I mean, if you just want to go, then go.
That's general questions about my pursuit of a degree here at the
That's
college.
fine. Well, let me just real quick. Either Danita or Jacob, do you have specific questions that I can help you with?
Oh no, I was just leaving right now. Sorry.
Okay, I just want to make sure that you didn't have a question because, Danita, do you have questions? Oh, go ahead.
So I'm kind of a junior.
Yeah, I looked at your degree works. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and I haven't like made it official yet because I just switched. Professor McEnroe came back from studying, and so Dr. Walter was my advisor, and now it's Dr. McEnroe, and so I just haven't worked out. I haven't told him yet that I want to do a political science minor yet, but I'm just looking through the courses, and I guess I just wanted your input as far as how much political science stuff Dr. Walter would be willing to cross-reference into some of these prerequisites for history.
Can you give me an example?
Here's an example. This class, Media and American Politics.
Okay, as a prerequisite though, for what?
Not as a prerequisite, but just as a requirement, as a history class requirement for competence in U.S. history.
Actually, one of the reasons I rewrote this class was so that it would have more of an American history narrative for just that purpose. So I would be willing to sort of advocate on your behalf if that was something you wanted to do. Sure.
I would appreciate that. And then I'm just asking you because you had said last term about your terrorism class that you'd be willing to do that also with that, which I feel would fall into the kind of the competence in world history. I don't know how far back they want us to go to be considered world history.
There again, I would defer to Dustin as chair of the program.
Yeah, of course.
But I wouldn't mind. I would be willing to approach him.
Okay.
A lot of it would depend on, the quality of your work and all that. But so far, what I've seen of your work is quite good. So, that's a pretty compelling justification.
Yeah, that helps. And I try to make, when I ask people to do me favors, I try to make it as easy as I can.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. So, it's not the kind of thing I would necessarily do with somebody who wasn't really applying themselves.
Yeah.
But you're clearly working at this. And
I really am. And I'm on kind of a time crunch with the GI Bill and trying to get
I understand
over this and the teaching degree. And so, I'm taking 20 credits this term. I'm really going after it.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to make sure I, fulfill the requirements, but if there's a little administrative stuff, I feel that some of these classes are relevant in more than one area.
I think the stronger case to be made so far would be the media class counting as American history.
Yes.
Because we cover, we started circa 1850.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a long span of time.
It is.
It
is.
So I think I can make a pretty compelling case there to Dustin. And I guess he would probably then get on DegreeWorks and petition for that. He would decide what that would count for, what class that would count for, or whether or not it would count as an elective or something like that. But when you're ready to do that, let me know and let me know specific classes, and I can meet with him on Zoom and we can discuss it, and then I can let you know what he decides.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. Probably should think about that sooner than later, but
yes,
we don't need to do it right now. But maybe, I don't know, were you thinking when are you planning on graduating?
I'm trying to graduate at end of spring term next year.
Okay, so we've got time. We've got
time.
But it's important that we know, because that's going to determine which subsequent classes you enroll in. So when you're ready to do that, let me know. Give me the classes you want and look in the catalog and see what you think they would be comparable to, right?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
And then I can put together the materials, and I'll have a Zoom meeting with Dustin, and I know he'll at least discuss it. I'm pretty sure, based on the original conversations that he and I had about what I was doing to rewrite 310, that he would accept 310. Okay. Beyond that, I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I was just floating it out there. I know Dr. Patterson had also said I think his class next term on what is he teaching next term? The American Collective Action. I think he said he could make a case for that as well. But I don't know. That's between those two.
But I think, yeah, again, I think we can certainly work with you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I really,
Well, especially under the constraints of GI. I mean, it's nice that the GI Bill's there, but they do, they squeeze you a little bit when
They do a little
when you
bit.
add
They
up.
do a little bit.
Yeah, and
I'm
so we
bringing a
understand
weird-
that.
I'm bringing a weird mishmash of like 15 years worth of college credits from high school till now. So, but
We'll work with you, because the main thing we want is we want to give you the opportunity to graduate with a degree.
I really appreciate
Yeah,
that.
and otherwise, I mean, you're putting in the work. It's clear that you're not asking for a handout. You just want to know, hey, isn't this kind of yeah, it's kind of history. So we'll work with you, man.
All right,
Don't
that's
worry about it. It's the main.
All right.
Just
I won't.
we'll work with you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. I'll see you next week.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Danita, I see you still in here. Did you have questions, or are you not aware that you're still connected? Okay. I think you just forgot to log out, so I'm going to shut it down.